a private jet worth $40 million, sat dead on a runway in upstate New York, and the woman who owned it had just promised, in front of 12 witnesses, to marry whoever could fix it. She said it the way you'd say something you knew could never come true. She had no idea a quiet mechanic standing at the edge of the hangar, holding his daughter's hand, was about to take her at her word. If you enjoy stories where pride gets humbled and quiet competence wins the day, press subscribe now so you don't miss how this one ends. Vivian Cross had not slept in 4 days. Her father had been dead for 6 months, and in that time she had learned that grief does not wait politely for a company to stabilize itself. Cross Aviation had been built by her father's hands, forged out of scrap, parts, and stubbornness in a hangar not unlike the one she now stood in, and it had grown into one of the most respected private aviation firms on the East Coast. But respect did not keep the board from circling. It did not keep her cousin Desmond Cross from smiling at her in meetings with a warmth that never once reached his eyes. The jet on the runway was not just any jet. It was the Falcon 9, the prototype her father had spent the last decade of his life perfecting the aircraft that was supposed to headline the biggest acquisition deal in the company's history. In 11 days, a delegation from a Gulf sovereign fund was flying in to inspect it, to fly in it, to decide whether Cross Aviation was worth $400 million or worth nothing at all. And for 6 weeks the plane had refused to start, not stall, not sputter, refuse, as if it had a mind of its own and had decided, along with everyone else in Vivian's life, that it no longer trusted her judgment. Every mechanic Cross Aviation employed, every consultant flown in from Seattle and Toulouse and Hamburg, had put their hands on that engine and walked away shaking their heads. 6 figures spent on diagnostics that turned up nothing. Desmond had used the delay as ammunition in every board conversation, dropping phrases like operational instability and leadership under strain with the practiced ease of a man who had rehearsed them in a mirror. So when the 12th specialist packed his tools and left without so much as an invoice, because he said there was nothing wrong that he could find and he would not charge her for his own failure, Vivian had stood on the tarmac in her heels and her tailored coat, exhaustion cracking through her professional armor, and said the thing that would follow her for the rest of her life. She said that at this point she would marry whoever could get that plane running. She said it to the sky, to the hangar, to no one in particular. She did not say it to him. But he heard it. His name was Caleb Hale, and he was 36 years old, and he had been standing near the hangar door with his 7-year-old daughter Ruthie because her school had a teacher-in-service day, and he had nowhere else to bring her. He worked part-time for the regional airfield's ground crew, doing basic maintenance on smaller charter planes, the kind of job that paid enough to keep the lights on and let him pick his daughter up from school most days. He was not supposed to be near the Cross Aviation hangar at all. He had wandered close because Ruthie liked watching the big jets, and because some old part of him, a part he tried very hard to keep asleep, had recognized the shape of that engine cowling from 100 yards away. He did not laugh at what Vivian said. He did not smirk the way the departing specialist's assistant had. He simply looked at the jet, then looked down at his daughter, who was swinging her small hand in his, and he said quietly, mostly to himself, that he'd need the whole night and nobody standing over his shoulder. Vivian turned around, startled that anyone had actually responded, and found herself looking at a man in a faded canvas jacket, with grease under his fingernails, and a little girl in a yellow raincoat, despite there being no rain. She asked him who he was. He told her his name. Told her he did light maintenance for charter operators 2 hangars down, and told her that if she was serious about the offer, she should have somebody draw up the terms because he intended to fix her airplane. She almost laughed. She had the sound halfway up her throat, the reflexive, polished laugh she used in board meetings to dismiss ideas she found beneath her. But something in his face stopped it. He was not posturing. He was not trying to impress her. He looked like a man stating a fact. The way you'd say the sky was gray or the runway was wet. She told him, with the particular coldness she reserved for people she assumed were wasting her time, that a dozen of the best aviation engineers in the country had already failed, and she did not see what a ground crew mechanic from a regional airfield thought he could do differently. He said that the best engineers in the country had probably been trained to look for what was complicated. Sometimes, he said, the problem was simple, and simple was the one thing nobody thought to check anymore. She did not have a response to that. And that unsettled her more than anything else that had happened all week. He asked if he could have access to the plane overnight. Just him. No cameras, no supervisors standing at the door, no interruptions. She told him that was not how Cross Aviation operated, that there were insurance protocols, security clearances, liability waivers 3 inches thick. He said that was fine, he understood, and he took his daughter's hand and started to walk away. It was Ruthie who stopped everything. She turned back toward Vivian with the unfiltered directness only a child possesses and asked her if she was the lady who was sad about her daddy. Vivian blinked, thrown entirely off balance. She asked the girl what she meant. And Ruthie said that her own daddy got sad like that too, after her mommy went to heaven, and that he fixed things when he was sad because it made the sad feel smaller. She said maybe if the lady let her daddy fix the airplane, the lady's sad would get smaller too. Vivian had built a decade of professional armor, specifically to withstand things like board votes and hostile press, and Desmond's oily insinuations. She had no armor at all for a 7-year-old in a yellow raincoat. She stood there on the tarmac with her mouth slightly open, and for the first time in 6 months, since the funeral, since the eulogy she had delivered without a single tear because she could not afford to let anyone see her break, she felt something crack straight down the middle of her chest. She said quietly that she would clear him for the night, alone, and she would have papers drawn up, not because she believed she'd ever have to honor them, but because a cross always honored her word. And if by some miracle he did what 12 specialists could not, she was not going to be the kind of woman who reneged. Caleb only nodded. He did not smile in triumph. He did not act as though he had won anything. He crouched down to Ruthie's height and told her they'd swing by Grandma Jones for the night and that he had work to do. Ruthie asked if the sad lady would be okay. He looked over Ruthie's small shoulder at Vivian, standing alone on the tarmac in her heels, with the wind pulling at her hair, and he said that he thought she'd be okay eventually. He said some people just needed somebody to believe them before they could believe themselves. Vivian did not know what to do with a sentence like that. She turned and walked back into her office and did not sleep either. That night, while the rest of the executive floor emptied out and the cleaning crew vacuumed hallways, she rarely noticed. Vivian sat at her father's old desk, the one she had never replaced, and pulled up the employee record for Caleb Hale. It was thinner than she expected, 2 years at the regional airfield. Before that, a gap, a 4-year gap with nothing in it at all, as though the man had not existed between the ages of 28 and 32. She frowned at the screen. Gaps like that usually meant prison, or illness, or something people wanted buried. She made a note to ask her head of security to run a deeper check, then found herself staring at the little girl's name instead, Ruth Ann Hale, and the mother's name listed as deceased 4 years prior, Lauren Hale. Cause of death? Not specified in the file. She closed the laptop. She told herself it was none of her business. She told herself that 17 more times before she actually believed it enough to try sleeping on the office couch. Caleb worked through the night in a hangar lit only by a single bank of overhead lights, and the glow of his own work lamp clipped to the cowling. He did not call anyone. He did not ask for help. He ran his hand along the turbine housing, the way another man might run his hand along an old friend's shoulder, feeling for the story the metal was trying to tell him. He had not touched an engine like this in 4 years, not since he'd walked away from a life he used to have, a life with a different last name attached to it in the aviation world, a name that used to open doors before he shut every one of them behind him on purpose. He thought about Lauren while he worked, the way he always did in hangars late at night, because those had been her favorite hours too, back when they were both young and reckless and in love with machines and each other in equal measure. She used to sit on an upturned crate and hand him tools, and ask him questions just to hear him explain things, not because she needed the answers. He missed that more than he let himself admit most days. Ruthie had her mother's eyes, the same startled, curious brightness. And some mornings that resemblance was the hardest part of getting out of bed. He found the problem at 2:30 in the morning. It was small. It was almost embarrassing in its smallness, given the money and the reputations that had been thrown at this airplane. A single bolt in the fuel control linkage, a specialized titanium fastener, unique to this exact model, had been swapped at some point for a standard aerospace bolt that looked identical to the untrained eye but had a fractionally different thread pitch. Under normal loads, it held fine. Under the specific vibration harmonic this particular engine produced at low altitude, it worked itself a hair loose. Just enough to disrupt the fuel signal, just enough to make the whole system flag out and shut down as a safety measure. It would never show up on standard diagnostics because the moment you shut the engine down to inspect it, the bolt reseated itself under gravity and looked perfectly normal. You had to catch it live mid-vibration to see the fault at all. It was the kind of failure only somebody who had actually helped design linkage systems, like this one, somebody who had spent years engineering for exactly this kind of vibration harmonic, would even think to test for. Caleb sat back on his heels and looked at the bolt in his palm for a long moment. He recognized the design. He recognized it because his own father had drawn the original schematics for this fuel control system 22 years earlier, back when Elias Hale was one of the most sought-after aeronautical engineers in the country, the man who had, in fact, consulted directly with Vivian's father on the earliest iterations of what would eventually become the Falcon line. Caleb had grown up in hangars just like this one, at his father's elbow, learning to read an engine the way other kids learn to read books. He had followed his father's path for a while, gone to the right schools, worked at the right firms, until the day everything in his life fell apart and he decided the corporate aviation world could survive perfectly well without him. He replaced the faulty bolt with a correct one from his own kit, tightened the linkage properly, and ran the engine through every test sequence he knew. It started on the first try. It ran smooth and steady, the sound settling into that low, contented hum that told anyone who knew engines that everything underneath was finally sitting right. He stood there in the empty hangar at 4 in the morning, oil on his forearms, and allowed himself something he rarely let himself feel anymore, a small, private flicker of pride. He did not throw the old bolt away. He put it in his pocket. Vivian arrived at the hangar just past dawn, her hair pulled back, her coat traded for a plainer jacket, having not slept and not particularly caring how it showed. She expected to find the plane exactly as broken as it had been the night before, and Caleb gone, having realized somewhere around midnight that he was in over his head. Instead, she found the hangar doors open, the engine cover reassembled, and Caleb sitting on an overturned crate with a coffee thermos, looking like a man who had simply finished a very long shift. She asked him if it worked. He said it did, and gestured for her to come listen for herself. She stood beside him while he started the engine, and the sound that came out of it was so smooth, so effortlessly right, that she actually put her hand against the fuselage as if to confirm it was real. 12 specialists, 6 weeks, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and a man in a canvas jacket had solved it overnight with a coffee thermos and his own 2 hands. She felt something like joy for exactly 4 seconds. Then she felt the cold weight of what she had promised settle back onto her shoulders, and her professional instincts, the ones honed over a decade of protecting herself from exactly this kind of vulnerability, snapped back into place. She laughed, a short, brittle sound, and said that of course she was not actually going to marry him, that it had been a joke born of exhaustion, and that she would compensate him generously for his work, more than generously, whatever figure he wanted to name. Caleb did not argue. He did not look wounded, or if he was, he did not let it show. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small box, plain, unmarked, the kind of thing you'd get from a hardware store rather than a jeweler. He held it out to her. She stared at it, then at him, unsure whether to be insulted or amused. She asked what it was. He told her to open it. Inside was a ring. Not diamond, not gold, the traditional sense, but hand-shaped titanium, machined and polished until it caught the early morning light streaming through the hangar doors. The surface worked into a subtle, spiraling pattern that looked almost like a fingerprint. She asked quietly what it was made from. He told her it was made from the bolt, the one that had grounded her airplane for 6 weeks, the one that had cost her sleep and reputation and nearly her family's company. He had melted it down and reshaped it himself in the small machine shop he kept in his garage at home, sometime around 3 in the morning while the new bolt settled into place in her engine. She did not know what to say. She turned the ring over in her fingers, feeling its unexpected weight. and asked him almost in a whisper why he would do something like that. He said that he did not expect her to marry him. He said he understood a joke when he heard one, and he was not a man who tried to trap anyone into anything, least of all a promise made out of exhaustion and grief. But he said the bolt was the reason her plane had failed, and now it was the reason it worked, and he thought there was something worth keeping in that, some proof that the same thing that breaks you can be remade into something that holds. He said his daughter believed that. He said he was trying to believe it again himself. Vivian stood there in the hangar, with oil-stained air around her, and a ring made from an aircraft bolt sitting cold and strange in her palm, and she felt the crack in her chest from the night before widen instead of close. She asked him his full name again, slower this time. He told her, Caleb Elias Hale, and something in the middle name caught in her memory like a hook. She had grown up hearing her father talk about a man named Elias Hale, an engineer he called the finest mind in the business. A man who had walked away from the industry after some family tragedy. Nobody ever explained to her in detail. Her father used to say, more than once, at dinners and quiet evenings in his study, that if Elias Hale ever had a son worth knowing, he hoped she'd meet him someday. She had always assumed it was one of her father's wistful, half-joking comments about the kind of man he wished she'd bring home, instead of the polished, hollow executives she'd dated in her 20s. She asked Caleb if Elias Hale was his father. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. He said yes, and that his father had passed 8 years ago, and that he did not talk about his father's old career often, because it belonged to a version of his life he had deliberately left behind after Lauren died. He said he'd trained under his father, worked with 2 major aerospace firms in his 20s, and then walked away from all of it to raise his daughter with his own 2 hands, instead of a nanny's, because that was the choice that let him sleep at night. Vivian felt the ground shift slightly under her, the way it does when a story you thought you understood turns out to have an entirely different shape underneath. She said quietly that her father used to talk about Elias Hale like he was some kind of legend. She said her father had told her, more than once, that he wished she could meet Elias Hale's son. Caleb went very still. He said he hadn't known that. Neither of them said anything else for a long moment. The engine, still running, filled the silence with its steady, healthy hum, a sound that felt to both of them like something had just been quietly, permanently repaired, that had nothing to do with fuel linkages at all. She did not put the ring on. Not then. But she did not give it back. She closed the box gently and held it in both hands like something fragile, and she told him that Cross Aviation would be paying him properly for his work, regardless of anything else, and that she would like, if he was willing, to speak with him further about consulting on the Falcon line going forward. She said it in her CEO voice, the one that closed deals, but her hands were not quite steady when she said it. Caleb said he'd think about it. He said he had a daughter to raise and a quiet life he'd built carefully around her, and he was not interested in trading that life for a corner office, no matter how the numbers looked. Vivian said she understood completely, though privately she did not yet, not fully, not in the way she would come to understand it over the following weeks. She went back to her office that morning and did something she had not done in months. She sat at her father's desk and cried, not out of grief this time, but out of something that felt dangerously close to hope, and she did not entirely know what to do with the feeling. Sand, word of the working jet spread through Cross Aviation before 9 in the morning. Desmond heard about it by 9:15, and his reaction was not relief, it was calculation. He had spent 6 weeks quietly using the plane's failure to erode confidence in Vivian's leadership among the board, planting seeds with select members about instability, about a company adrift without her father's steady hand. A working jet fixed by an outside nobody threatened to undo 6 weeks of careful work in a single morning. Desmond began making calls before lunch. He reached out to a contact in aviation press, framing the story not as a triumph but as a scandal. A reckless CEO handing over sensitive aircraft access to an unvetted outsider with a mysterious employment gap in his background. A man who could have sabotaged the plane just as easily as fixed it. A man who, as it happened, had a father with a checkered departure from the industry, under circumstances Desmond intended to dig up and distort. He did not care what the truth actually was. He cared what story could be made to look true long enough to matter. Over the following 2 weeks, Vivian found herself in an increasingly strange position, defending a man she barely knew against a cousin she had once trusted implicitly. Desmond brought concerns to the board about liability exposure, about the optics of the CEO's personal involvement with a contractor, about whether Cross Aviation's reputation could survive scrutiny into Caleb's background, right as the sovereign fund's inspection approached. He was careful never to say anything overtly false. He simply arranged true facts into a shape designed to look damning. The gap in Caleb's employment record, the unconventional overnight access to a $40 million aircraft. The rumor, which Desmond made sure reached the right ears, that the CEO had made an inappropriate personal promise to secure the repair. Vivian, for her part, found herself spending more time around the airfield than her schedule strictly required. She told herself it was due diligence, verifying the repair held under further testing, documenting the consulting arrangement properly for the board. She told herself several other things too, none of which she fully believed. What she actually did was watch Caleb work. She watched him teach Ruthie how to check tire pressure using a gauge sized for her small hands, patiently, without a trace of the impatience Vivian associated with brilliant men who'd been forced to explain simple things. She watched him eat lunch sitting on the tarmac with his daughter, sharing a single sandwich cut precisely in half, laughing at something Ruthie said, with a warmth Vivian did not know men in his position, men who had clearly once had bigger lives, were supposed to still have left in them. One afternoon, Ruthie found Vivian standing near the hangar office alone, and without any preamble, the way children do. She asked Vivian if she was going to marry her daddy. Vivian, caught entirely off guard, crouched down and told the girl gently that grown-up promises were complicated, that sometimes people said things they didn't fully mean, and that she and her daddy were just working together for now. Ruthie considered this with the grave seriousness only a 7-year-old can summon, and said that her daddy didn't make promises he didn't mean, and that if he gave someone a ring, even a joke ring, it probably wasn't only a joke to him. Then she skipped off toward the vending machine, leaving Vivian crouched on the tarmac with her heart doing something unfamiliar and uncomfortable in her chest. It was during this stretch of weeks that Vivian learned the rest of Caleb's story, not all at once but in fragments, offered quietly over shared coffee during long test runs. He told her about Lauren, about the car accident that took her 4 years ago on a wet road outside Albany, about how he had been on a work trip in Singapore when it happened, consulting on an engine redesign for a firm he'd since resigned from entirely, and how he had promised himself at her funeral that he would never again be the kind of father who was 3 time zones away. When it mattered, he told her he had turned down 2 job offers since then that would have paid triple what he made now, because both required travel he was no longer willing to do. He told her quietly, without asking for sympathy, that fixing her jet was the first time in 4 years he'd let himself feel like his old skills were worth something again, and that it had scared him more than he expected. Vivian, in turn, told him about her own father, about the eulogy she delivered without crying, because she was terrified that if she started she would not be able to run the company the following Monday. She told him about growing up, watching her father choose the business over dinners, over birthdays, over her mother, and how she had promised herself she would never make her employees feel like an afterthought, the way she sometimes felt as a child even as she recognized saying it aloud for the first time. That she had built her entire adult life around exactly the same imbalance her father had modeled for her. Caleb listened, without offering easy comfort. He simply said that it sounded like she was carrying her father's company and her father's approval at the same time, and that those were 2 very different weights, and that she was allowed to want to put one of them down. Nobody had ever said anything like that to her before. She did not answer him. She just sat there on the crate beside him in the quiet hangar and let the sentence settle somewhere it would not easily leave. The confrontation Desmond had been engineering came to a head 11 days later on the morning the Sovereign Fund's delegation arrived to inspect the Falcon 9 and finalize the acquisition terms. Desmond had timed his move deliberately. He called an emergency session of the board for that same morning before the delegation's scheduled walkthrough, and formally proposed a motion of no confidence in Vivian's leadership, citing what he called reckless operational judgment, referencing the repair, the mysterious contractor, and rumors of a personal impropriety that he implied. Without ever quite stating outright, compromised her ability to lead the company through the acquisition. Vivian stood before the board in the same conference room, where her father used to run quarterly meetings. And for one terrible moment, she felt 15 years old again, wondering if she would ever be considered enough. Desmond spoke smoothly, citing Caleb's employment gap as evidence of an unvetted risk, suggesting that for all anyone knew, the mechanic could have introduced a fault that would resurface mid-flight. With the delegation aboard, an implication just short of outright sabotage that landed hard in a room full of people terrified of liability. It was at this exact moment that Caleb walked into the boardroom, having been called in by Vivian's assistant at her direction the night before, not to defend himself, but because Vivian had insisted the technical record be presented properly rather than through Desmond's distortions. He carried with him a small case, and inside it, laid out with careful precision, sat the original faulty bolt he had removed from the engine, alongside detailed photographs he had taken with his own equipment, documenting the fault, the exact thread mismatch, the harmonic vibration data he had gathered running the engine at various loads through the night, and a signed, time-stamped technical report written in language dense enough that half the board could not follow it, but precise enough that any aviation engineer in the world could verify every word. He explained calmly, without theatrics, exactly what had gone wrong with the plane, exactly how it had gone unnoticed by 12 previous specialists, and exactly why the fault could not have been sabotage, because the incorrect bolt bore machining marks consistent with a manufacturing batch error traced to a supplier contract that, as it turned out, had been personally renegotiated 18 months earlier by none other than Desmond himself. In a cost-cutting measure, he had pushed through over the objections of the original engineering team, switching to a cheaper fastener supplier, without running the full compatibility testing standard procedure required. The room went very quiet. Vivian looked at Desmond, and for the first time in 6 months, she did not feel exhaustion or grief. Looking at her family's company, she felt clarity. She said, in a voice that did not waver, that the plane had not failed because of reckless judgment. It had failed because someone in this very room had cut a corner to save a few dollars on a fastener contract, and then spent 6 weeks manufacturing a crisis to hide his own decision behind her reputation. She said that the mechanic standing beside her, a man Desmond had tried to paint as an unvetted risk, was in fact the son of Elias Hale, the very engineer who had helped her father design the aircraft system in question, and that he had solved in one night what every specialist the company had hired could not solve in 6 weeks. Using nothing but skill her cousin had never bothered to acquire, and integrity her cousin had clearly never valued. Desmond's composure finally cracked. He started to object, started to argue that the supplier change had been a legitimate business decision, but the board's loyal old accountant, a woman named Marion Petrosian, who had kept Cross Aviation's books for 31 years and had quietly, on her own initiative, the original procurement records the week before, after noticing irregularities in the fastener contract's paper trail, stood up and placed a folder on the table. She said she had been waiting for the right moment to bring this forward, and she supposed this was it. Inside were the original vendor comparisons Desmond had buried, showing the cheaper supplier had been flagged by the engineering team as non-compliant with the aircraft specifications, a warning Desmond had overridden and then omitted from the official record entirely. The vote of no confidence did not merely fail. It reversed itself entirely into a unanimous vote to remove Desmond from the board and terminate his position as Chief Operating Officer, with several members openly stating their intent to pursue further review of his other procurement decisions across the company. Desmond left the building that afternoon, escorted by building security, his composure entirely gone, shouting something about lawsuits that nobody in the room took seriously. Caleb stood quietly beside Vivian throughout all of it, saying little beyond the technical facts required, but when she finished speaking, when the room sat in stunned silence processing what had just unfolded, he placed a steady hand briefly on her shoulder, not as a gesture for the board's benefit, but simply because she looked, for one unguarded second, like She needed it. She did not shrug it off. She let it stay there a moment longer than professional decorum strictly required, and nobody in that room watching mistook what they were seeing for anything other than what it was. The sovereign funds delegation arrived 2 hours later to a company that had just cleaned house in the most literal sense possible, and the Falcon 9 ran flawlessly through every test they requested. The acquisition deal closed 19 days later at a valuation 12% higher than originally projected, largely because the delegation's own engineers, upon reviewing Caleb's technical documentation, expressed something close to professional astonishment at the thoroughness of the diagnostic work and asked, more than once, whether Cross Aviation intended to keep that consultant on retainer. Vivian offered Caleb a formal position 2 weeks after the deal closed, head of technical integrity for the Falcon line, with full authority over supplier vetting and engineering standards. He structured it deliberately around school pickup hours. No overnight travel without his approval. No mandatory relocation. An office on site with a small adjoining room where Ruthie could do her homework on the afternoons. Her after-school program let out early, an arrangement Vivian personally insisted on before Caleb even had the chance to ask. Caleb sat with the offer for 3 days before accepting. He told her when he finally did that he was not accepting it because of the money, though the money was fair, and not because of the title, though the title mattered less to him than she seemed to expect. He said he was accepting it because, for the first time since Lauren died, someone had built a place for him to be good at his work and be present for his daughter at the same time, instead of asking him to choose between the two. Vivian, in the months that followed, began quietly reshaping other parts of the company as well. She instituted a policy allowing any employee with dependent children flexible scheduling without penalty, to advancement, something her father would never have considered necessary, and something Desmond would have mocked as soft. She found she did not particularly care what Desmond would have thought about anything anymore. It was on a Tuesday evening in early autumn, months after the jet first refused to start, that Vivian found herself back in the same hangar, alone with Caleb, after Ruthie had fallen asleep on a blanket in the corner office. Worn out from a full day of watching test flights, she declared, with great authority, to be the best day of her entire life. The Falcon 9 sat quiet and gleaming under the overhead lights, fully operational, fully vindicated, a plane that had once nearly cost Vivian everything, now sitting as proof of exactly the opposite. She still had the ring. She had never worn it, not officially, but she had kept it in the top drawer of her father's old desk, and some nights, working late, she found herself taking it out and turning it over in her fingers the way she had that first morning in the hangar. She asked Caleb finally if he had meant what he said that morning about the bolt, about things that break, being remade into something that holds. He said he had meant every word of it, though he admitted he had not fully believed it himself back then. He said he had spent 4 years convinced that the version of himself capable of loving someone fully, of trusting someone with his whole, complicated, hidden, careful life, had died along with Lauren. He said meeting Vivian, watching her stubbornness and her exhaustion and her fierce, guarded loyalty to a company she'd never once complained about inheriting, had made him wonder if maybe that version of himself had only ever been sleeping. Vivian told him that she had spent her whole life believing love was a transaction, something you traded for security or status or approval, because that was the only model her father had ever shown her. She said, watching Caleb with Ruthie, watching a man choose presence over power, again and again without resentment, had taught her something her father's entire life's work never had, that some things are worth more precisely because they cannot be bought, engineered, or negotiated into existence. She said she did not want to offer him a transaction. She said she simply wanted, if he was willing, to try building something slowly, the way he built things, with patience and attention and no guarantee of how it would turn out. Caleb did not say anything grand in return. He reached over, took her hand, the one that had carried the weight of the company and her father's memory for 6 long months, and held it, simply, without ceremony. She let him. Ruthie stirred slightly in her sleep in the corner office, one small hand curled beneath her cheek, entirely unaware that the quiet moment happening a few feet away was the beginning of exactly the family she had been quietly hoping for since the day she first asked a sad lady in a hangar if she was okay. Vivian never did put the ring on that night, and neither of them rushed toward anything resembling a formal proposal in the months that followed. But she kept the ring close, and Caleb kept coming back to that hangar, and Ruthie kept asking. Every few weeks, with the patient persistence only a child can sustain, when exactly grown-ups planned on figuring things out. And slowly, quietly, without any of the fanfare that had marked the disaster and the drama that first brought them together, they did. What started as a sarcastic promise on an exhausted afternoon turned out to be the truest thing Vivian Cross ever said, not because a plane got fixed, but because a bolt that once caused a company's near collapse became, in the hands of a patient man who had nothing left to prove, the very thing that held her life back together. The jet had been broken because someone cut a corner nobody else noticed, and it turned out love, real love, the kind neither of them had trusted themselves to want anymore, was fixed the very same way. Slowly, honestly, one small, overlooked essential piece at a time.